My house in Pasco is not the most conspicuous on our street. It's 2 stories high with a small garden and an old apple tree by the fence. I, Miriam Barlow, have lived here for almost 50 years. I'm 79 now, and every creaky floorboard in this house holds memories of my life with Howard. Today I woke up at first light, a habit from my days in the lab. An analytical chemist can't afford to be late, especially when you're working with unstable compounds at Western Pharma. 27 years I spent among test tubes, flasks, and chromatographs. Howard often joked that I could determine the composition of any substance by smell alone. In a way, that was true. I poured myself a cup of strong tea and went out onto the veranda, wrapped in an old knit cardigan. October had been cold this year. The leaves of the maples outside had already turned purple, reminding me of the reagent phenolphthalein, which changes color so sharply when the acidity of the environment changes. Nature is the best chemist. That's what I always told my students when I taught college classes after retirement. A phone call interrupted my musings. I reluctantly walked back into the house and picked up the phone. Mom? It's Lloyd. My son's voice always gave me mixed feelings. Happy that he remembered. Bitterness that he doesn't remember as often as he used to. Good morning, Lloyd. How are you doing in there? You doing okay? He sounded a little concerned. I'm fine. As always, I replied, knowing that my son wasn't really interested in my well-being. Tirza and I were thinking of coming over this weekend to discuss your finances. You know, at your age, it's hard to manage your own possessions anymore. Here it is. Again. For the past 3 months, Lloyd had been calling with the same theme: my finances, my house, my possessions. In the past, he might not show up for months, but now he's being so sonly about it. My finances are fine, Lloyd. I don't need any help with estate administration. There was a pause. I could practically see him clutching the phone, trying to hide his irritation. Mom, the neighborhood is growing. Real estate prices are going up. Tirza says your house is now worth 3 times what it was 5 years ago. It would be wise to, sell it and move into a nursing home? I finished for him, not hiding my sarcasm. No, Lloyd, my answer didn't change. You were always stubborn, he sighed. We'll stop by on Saturday anyway. We need to check the roof before winter. I knew he didn't care about the roof. Howard had always taken care of the house, and after he died, I'd continued the tradition. Last year, I hired a roofing crew. They replaced some rafters and shingles on the north slope. But there was no point in arguing with Lloyd. He had long ago decided that I was old and don't get it. All right, come on over. I'll make your favorite apple pie, I said, even though I knew Tirza never touched my baked goods for fear of her figure. When the conversation ended, I felt the familiar heaviness in my heart. A wall of alienation had long since grown between my son and me. Lloyd was a late bloomer Howard, and I were in our 40s when he was born. Maybe that was why we'd always overprotected him, or maybe it was something else. Howard was a strict father, demanding. An engineer to the core, he expected the same precision and discipline from his son. But Lloyd grew up dreamy and uncoordinated. I returned to the veranda and looked out at the orchard. The apple tree that Howard and I had planted the year Lloyd was born was still bearing fruit. This year, it was especially full of apples, the branches bending to the ground under the weight of them. We'd have to pick them before the frost. The phone rang again. This time it was Rhoda, my neighbor on the left. She's 65, but she makes me feel ancient. She's full of energy, practicing yoga and always involved in community initiatives. Miriam, you won't believe it. The neighborhood council has approved a development plan for the vacant lot behind our house. It's going to be a shopping center. Her voice was ringing with excitement. A shopping center? I questioned her. But there's a protected area there. It used to be. Now the status has been changed. They say it's good for our houses, infrastructure, jobs. Real estate prices are already skyrocketing, so that's what this is about. I can see why Lloyd and especially Tirza are so interested in my house. She's an accountant and always had a nose for a good deal. I remembered the first time Lloyd talked about helping with property management 3 months ago. It was right after the town meeting where this development project must have been discussed. Tirza must have heard about it before anyone else. She had connections in city government. Rhoda, have you thought of selling your house? I asked, even though I knew the answer. Are you kidding? Where would I go? My whole life is here. Besides, when the mall is built, the houses will be worth even more. I'd rather wait and leave everything to the kids. We talked some more about the developer's plans, and I hung up the phone, feeling increasingly anxious. Not about the mall, I don't care much about what's behind the fence anymore. But because of Lloyd and Tirza, their sudden interest in my finances now made sense. I made more tea and sat down at the old oak table in the kitchen. It was the table that remembered all our family dinners. Howard always sat at the head, serious and quiet. Lloyd across from me, usually immersed in his own thoughts. We were never the model happy family from the advertising brochures, but we stuck together. After Howard died 5 years ago, things changed. Lloyd visited me even less often, usually only on holidays or when he needed something. Tirza almost never came, citing work or a migraine. I didn't insist. She and I never got along. She always looked at me as a nuisance, an obstacle between her and Lloyd's inheritance. Suddenly, I remembered a conversation with my friend Judith last week. We had met at the supermarket, and she had mentioned that she had seen Lloyd and Tirza at the bank. They looked upset, and Tirza was arguing loudly with the manager. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wondered, what if they were having financial problems? About 2 years ago, Lloyd had mentioned that he was going to start his own business, a financial planning consulting firm. He'd always been ambitious, but he hadn't always had business acumen. What if the business went under? What if they took out a loan, and now they can't pay it back? I looked at Howard's picture on the wall. He was looking at me with his serious eyes, as if warning me about something. Howard had always been prudent and prudent. It was because of his prudence that we had saved enough for me to live in peace after his death. What would he say now? Be careful, Miri, I heard his voice say. It's not all gold that glitters. I decided to call the bank and check the status of my accounts. Better to be safe. I dialed the number and, giving the necessary identification information, asked about my deposits and securities. Everything was in order, no unusual transactions or inquiries. I asked to temporarily restrict access to the accounts. Any transactions now required my personal presence at the bank. With my finances taken care of, I decided to look at the house, the one that Lloyd was so interested in. Despite my age, I had kept it in good condition. Howard had taught me the basics of home repair, and I hired professionals for the big jobs. The house was solid, like everything my husband had done. I walked through every room, checking windows and doors. Howard's study, which I'd turned into a library, was the one I stayed in the longest. It was where his notes, his drawings, his journals were kept. Howard was pedantic. He recorded everything from electricity usage to the smallest changes in the house's construction. Lloyd and Tirza never came in here. I think this room reminded Lloyd of his father's strictness, of how Howard criticized him for his lack of discipline and determination. Or maybe they just weren't interested in old books and papers. I pulled one of Howard's diaries off the shelf and flipped through the yellowed pages. Neat handwriting, diagrams, calculations. Howard was no ordinary engineer. In the 60s, he'd been involved in a government program to build bomb shelters. The paranoia of the Cold War was affecting our quiet little town. I knew Lloyd wasn't coming over on Saturday to check out the roof. He'd push to sell the house again, maybe even try to convince me to sign some papers. I have to be prepared. Howard always said, the best defense is a sound strategy. Closing my journal, I decided to call my old friend Bert, who worked as a lawyer. We hadn't spoken in months, and I wanted to make sure my will was in order. Not that I was planning on dying anytime soon, but as you get older, you start to think about these things. The conversation with Bert proved enlightening. He advised me to update my will and told me about new legal tools that could protect my assets. We agreed to meet the following week to finalize the paperwork. After that conversation, I felt more confident. No matter what Lloyd and Tirza planned, I wasn't going to give up without a fight. This house was mine, and it would stay that way until I decided otherwise. Saturday came faster than I wanted it to. I got up early to bake the promised apple pie. My hands automatically performed the familiar motions of measuring flour, slicing apples, beating eggs and sugar. I got the recipe for this pie from my mother, and she got it from her mother. 3 generations of women, and each one added something different. My secret is a pinch of cardamom and a dash of vanilla extract. As I was kneading the dough, I thought about Lloyd. What he was like as a child, a quiet, dreamy boy with big gray eyes so similar to Howard's. He loved it when I read him bedtime stories about space travel and galaxies far away. Back then, in the 60s, all the boys raved about space. When he became a teenager, everything changed. Howard expected his son to follow in his footsteps, to go to Polytechnic, to become an engineer. But Lloyd was more interested in the humanities. They often argued, and those arguments never ended peacefully. I tried to mediate, but in the end they were both dissatisfied. Howard thought I was indulging my son's softness, and Lloyd was sure I was always on his father's side. After high school, Lloyd went to university to study economics, a compromise that pleased no one. He wasn't a natural mathematician, and he was an average student, spending more time at student parties than on his books. It was at one of these parties that he met Tirza Eddington. Even mentally saying her name, I feel a chill emanating from those sounds. A beautiful, ambitious girl from a wealthy family, she saw Lloyd as malleable material from which to mold a husband to her liking. Or maybe she just liked his gray eyes, so expressive, so honest. Their wedding took place 6 months after they met. Howard was against it. He thought that Lloyd was not ready for family life yet, not yet on his feet, not yet finished his education. But Tirza insisted, and Lloyd, as usual, could not resist the strong will. The first years of their marriage were relatively quiet. Tirza worked in the accounting department of a large company. Lloyd graduated from university and got a job as a junior analyst in a bank. They lived in a rented apartment across town and visited us rarely, usually on holidays or birthdays. I noticed a change in Lloyd. He was more reserved, more cautious about what he said, as if he were always afraid of saying the wrong thing. Tirza was always there, controlling the conversation, guiding it in the right direction. When Howard brought up uncomfortable topics, such as why they were still renting an apartment instead of taking out a mortgage, Tirza skillfully translated the conversation, while Lloyd simply remained silent. The ringing of the doorbell interrupted my memories. I flinched. It was only 9 in the morning, too early for Lloyd and Tirza to arrive. They usually showed up around lunchtime. Judith, an old friend of mine, stood on the doorstep. We had met 30 years ago when we worked in the same lab. She was retired now, like me, but unlike me, she led an active social life, traveling, volunteering, even having an affair with a retired Danish man she had met on a cruise. Miriam, I was driving by and thought I'd stop by. Are you busy? She was holding a bag of blueberries. I just got back from the farmer's market. Thought you might like them. Come on in. I let her in. I was just about to have tea, and the cake's almost ready. We sat down on the veranda where I had set a small table. Judith was always observant. She noticed my tension at once. Is something wrong? You look worried. I told her about Lloyd and Tirza's impending visit, their sudden interest in my finances and the house, the development plan. Did you know they were having business problems? Judith asked, sipping her tea. What business? Lloyd started his consulting firm about a year ago. Tirza quit her job to help him. I thought you knew. He didn't tell me anything. I felt a pang of resentment. His own son didn't see fit to share such important news. They took out a big loan against their apartment. They bought an office in a business center, hired employees. Tirza told my niece they'd be millionaires soon. And what happened? I don't know exactly, but business didn't pick up. I saw them at the bank 2 weeks ago, arguing with the manager. It wasn't a pleasant conversation. Now it all makes sense. Their sudden interest in my house, their insistent offers to help with the finances, Tirza's strange hints that, at my age, I need to think about my future. Do you think they want my house? I asked directly. I don't know, Miriam. But be careful. When people are desperate, they can do a lot of things. We talked for another hour. Judith told me about her upcoming trip to Denmark, showed me pictures of her friend Niels, a tall, gray-haired man with kind eyes. I listened half-heartedly. My thoughts kept returning to Lloyd and Tirza. When Judith left, I went back to preparing the house for my son and daughter-in-law. I took the pie out of the oven, set the table in the parlor, even picked asters from the garden for a vase. Tirzah loved flowers, which was almost the only trait of hers that I approved of. At exactly noon, I heard the sound of a car pulling up. I looked out the window and saw Lloyd's silver sedan. It was just the two of them, Lloyd driving, Tirzah in the passenger seat, checking her makeup in the rearview mirror. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. Mom, Lloyd hugged me. He looked gaunt, shadows under his eyes. You look good. Hello, Miriam. Tirzah nodded, making no attempt to hug me. Her flawless makeup couldn't hide the tension on her face. We walked into the living room. Lloyd immediately noticed the pie and smiled the first time all day that his smile looked genuine. Apple? With cardamom? He inhaled the aroma. Just like when I was a kid. Sit down, I pointed to the couch. Tea? Or maybe coffee? Tea, thank you, Lloyd replied. Nothing for me. Tirzah looked around the room with an appraising eye. Did you change the curtains? Yes, last spring. The old ones were faded. I spilled the tea. We sat in awkward silence until Lloyd decided to start talking. Mom, Tirzah and I have something important we wanted to talk to you about. I'm listening. I tried to remain calm, though my insides were clenched. It's about your house, Tirzah said, taking the initiative. You live here alone, and it's hard to maintain such a large house. We're worried about your safety. My safety is my concern, Tirzah. I looked her straight in the eye. And I keep the house in good order. But you're not young anymore, Mom, Lloyd interjected. What if you fall, or forget to turn off the gas? I've never forgotten to turn off the gas in 30 years. I felt the irritation boiling up inside me. And I rarely fall. Miriam. Tirzah stepped forward, her voice softer but her eyes still cold. We suggest you sell the house. It's a great time. Real estate prices are rising in your neighborhood. You can buy a comfortable apartment closer to the center and put the rest of the money in the bank. This will give you a comfortable retirement. And you, a commission on the sale? I asked, looking at my sister-in-law. You're working with Lloyd at the consulting firm now, am I right? Or have you already closed down? Tirzah turned pale. Lloyd looked like I slapped him. How do you know about the firm? He asked, setting the cup aside. So it's true. You took out a loan, opened a business, and it went under. I shook my head. And now you need the money from the sale of my house to pay off your debts. Tirzah jumped up, her face contorted with anger. You don't understand anything. We're trying to help you. Sit down, Lloyd said quietly, and to my surprise, she complied. Mom, it's not like that. Yes, we have financial difficulties, but we are worried about you. This house is a big responsibility. Don't lie to me, Lloyd. I looked at the son I had once taught to always tell the truth. You've never cared about this house. Until recently, you and Tirzah had visited me once every 6 months, and even then reluctantly. And now you're suddenly showing such concern. Why? Tirzah and Lloyd looked at each other. I saw Tirzah nod discreetly to her husband as if giving permission. We found out about the building plan, Lloyd finally admitted. Your house is worth twice, if not 3 times as much now. We'd be foolish not to take advantage of this opportunity. The opportunity to leave me without a house? I couldn't hide my bitterness. The house where I've lived for 50 years, where you were born and raised? Don't be dramatic, Miriam. Tirzah rolled her eyes. It's just a building. You can live anywhere you want. It's not just a building to me, Tirzah. It's my home. And I'm not moving anywhere. Her sister-in-law's face turned rigid. You're selfish, she said quietly, but with such cold fury that I flinched. You've always been selfish, sitting here, in this huge house alone, while Lloyd and I stand to lose everything. The bank has already started foreclosure proceedings on our apartment. In a month, we'll have nowhere to live. Tirzah, please. Lloyd put his hand on his wife's shoulder, but she threw it away. No, let her know. We're on the verge of bankruptcy. Creditors are calling every day, and she doesn't care. I looked at my son. He was sitting with his head down, clearly crushed by the situation. At that moment, he reminded me of a little boy who was afraid to admit that he had broken his mother's favorite vase. Is it true? You could lose your apartment? I asked, feeling the anger give way to anxiety. Whatever my son was, I didn't want him to end up on the streets. Yes, Lloyd answered quietly. We owed the bank $200,000. The firm went under, no customers. We spent all our savings and took out another loan to stay afloat. But we couldn't. I was silent, digesting what I'd heard. $200,000. That's a lot of money. I didn't have that kind of money. My savings were much more modest. We're not asking you for money, Miriam, Tirza said, calming down a little. We're just offering a solution that will help everyone. You sell the house, buy a smaller apartment, we split the difference. Part for you to live well into your old age, and part for us to pay off our debts and make a fresh start. And you are sure that this house is worth so much? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Rhoda had talked about the sharp rise in real estate prices. Absolutely, Tirza's face brightened. I consulted a realtor. Your house and lot could be worth about $600,000. That's a lot of money, Miriam. You could buy a nice apartment for $200,000 and split the remaining $400. $200 for you, $200 for us. I could see the familiar fire of greed in her eyes. Tirza was already mentally dividing the money from the sale of my house. The house that Howard built. The house where I kept all my memories. I need to think about it, I said finally. It's a big decision. Of course, Mom. Lloyd squeezed my hand. We understand. But don't take too long, we don't have much time left. The rest of the visit passed in a tense atmosphere. Tirza visibly relaxed, thinking she had convinced me. She even tasted the pie, a rare occasion. Lloyd was thoughtful, barely participating in the conversation. When they were ready to leave, I walked them to the door. We'll come back in a week, Tirza said. I'll have all the paperwork for the sale ready by then. I nodded, not promising anything concrete. When their car came around the corner, I went back inside and sank heavily into the chair. I knew for sure now, Lloyd and Tirza wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. My house. My life. The 3 days after Lloyd and Tirza's visit passed in heavy thought. I walked around the house, going through things, remembering the stories associated with them. Here was a picture from our wedding, Howard, looking young, serious, in a suit. There's a scrapbook of Lloyd's first steps, a chubby little boy, tentatively shuffling his feet. Here's a collection of minerals Howard and I collected on our rare travels. Each piece had its own story, its own value, not material, emotional. How do you explain that to Tirza? To her, a house is just an asset that can be converted into money. For Lloyd, perhaps a childhood memory, but not strong enough to outweigh his wife's influence and financial concerns. On Thursday, I called Bert to consult about my rights. He confirmed what I already knew. The house belongs to me and no one can force me to sell it. But he also warned that there are legal mechanisms to declare an elderly person incapacitated and appoint a guardian to manage the property. This usually happens in cases of dementia or other serious illnesses, but there are also cases of abuse of this procedure. You have to be careful, Miriam, Bert said. If they decide to go this way, you'll need independent medical reports to prove your competence. I thanked him for his advice and asked him to prepare the documents to protect me in case of emergency. We agreed to meet the following Tuesday, but I didn't live to see Tuesday, at least not in my house. On Friday, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, while I was transplanting violets, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting guests, and to be honest, I wasn't in the mood for small talk, but I went to open the door. Lloyd and Tirza stood on the threshold. Both of them were dressed casually, Lloyd in a suit and Tirza in an austere gray dress. Behind them, I noticed 2 other men, one in work overalls, the other carrying a large bag of tools. Lloyd? I looked at my son in surprise. We didn't have an appointment today. Can I come in? His voice sounded strange, as if he were reading a prepared text. I stepped aside to let them into the house. The men stayed on the porch. What's going on? I asked as we entered the living room. Who are these people? Lloyd and Tirza looked at each other. Then Tirza nodded, as if giving her husband permission to speak. It was their usual way of communicating. She was always the puppeteer, he the puppet. Mom, Lloyd began, avoiding looking me in the eye. We've made a decision. It's no longer safe for you to live alone in this house. What are you talking about? I'm doing fine. I felt the anxiety building inside me. We have reason to believe that you can't take care of yourself adequately. Tirza stepped in, pulling a file from her bag. We've noticed signs of forgetfulness, inability to keep the house in order. This is absurd. I couldn't believe my ears. My house is in perfect condition and there's nothing wrong with my memory. Miriam, Tirza stepped forward, her voice suddenly soft, but her eyes remained cold. We realize this is hard to accept, but sometimes people your age don't notice changes in their condition. Lloyd and I have made the decision to take you in. And the house? I knew immediately where they were going with this. You'll sell it, of course, to pay off your debts? Tirza's face trembled a little. I'd hit the mark. The house is no longer your concern, Mother, Lloyd said, looking at me for the first time. It's ours now. By what right? I tried to speak calmly, though my insides were seething with indignation. By the right of your next of kin. Tirza pulled a document out of a folder. We have a doctor's report that you need constant care and supervision. What doctor? I snatched the paper from her. I haven't had any examination. Dr. Webster, Tirza replied. He examined you last month when you had bronchitis. I remembered, indeed, 5 weeks ago, I had seen a general practitioner for a lingering cough. But there had been no assessment of my mental state. It was a routine bronchitis consultation. It's a forgery. I threw the paper on the table. Dr. Webster did not conduct any evaluation of my mental state. He noticed signs of cognitive decline, Tirza calmly parried. And as a medical professional, he felt it was his duty to inform your next of kin. You bribed him. I looked at my sister-in-law with disgust. Or tricked him. Dr. Webster would never have written such a report after a routine throat examination. Mom, please. Lloyd made a conciliatory gesture. Let's not make this any harder than it has to be. Pack the essentials and we'll go to our place. You'll be comfortable there, I promise. What about my house? I wasn't going to give up. We'll take care of it, Tirza said, a look of triumph in her eyes. I hired the men outside to change the locks, for your own safety. At that moment, I realized they weren't asking or discussing. They were putting me on the spot. They're here to take my house, and no argument will stop them. I'm not going anywhere, I said firmly, crossing my arms over my chest. This is my home, and I'm staying here. Tirza sighed with feigned regret. We had hoped you would be reasonable, Miriam. But if you insist, she nodded to Lloyd, who suddenly grabbed me by the shoulders. I'm sorry, Mom, but it's for your own good, he said, pushing me toward the door. What are you doing? Let go of me. I tried to pull away, but my son's grip was too strong. It's dangerous for people your age to live alone, Tirza repeated, following me. We're just looking out for you. I found myself on the porch, stunned and scared. One of the men was already changing the lock on the front door, the other headed toward the back of the house. You can't do this, I shouted, attracting the attention of the neighbors. This is my house. You have no right. We have all the necessary paperwork, Tirza replied coldly, showing some papers. Lloyd is your legal guardian now, and he's decided you need to move out. I'm calling the police. I reached into my pocket for my cell phone, but it wasn't there. I'd left it in the house on the living room table. Please, Tirza smiled with superiority. Call it in. We'll show them the doctor's report and the court order for custody. What court order? I felt the ground slipping from under my feet. There was no trial. There was a hearing in absentia. Lloyd looked guilty but determined. The judge agreed with Dr. Webster that you needed custody. I couldn't believe what was happening. It was like some kind of nightmare. My own son and his wife had tricked me out of control of my life, my property. Lloyd, wake up! I looked at my son, trying to get through to him. You know that I'm of sound mind. You can't do this to me. For a moment, doubt flashed in his eyes, but Tirza immediately put her hand on his shoulder and his gaze became detached again. I'm doing what I have to do, Mother. Believe me, it's best for everyone. At that moment, my belongings, clothes, books, personal items, began to be taken out of the house. Everything was piled up on the front lawn. What are you doing? I watched in horror as strangers' hands carelessly handled my things. Gathering what you might need, Lloyd answered. We'll sort through the rest later. I watched as one of the workers took out a box of my jewelry, not particularly valuable in material terms, but infinitely precious to me. There was my mother's wedding ring, the brooch Howard had given me for our 20th anniversary, the silver bracelet I'd bought on my only trip to Europe. These are my personal items. I rushed toward the man, trying to take the box, but Lloyd held me back. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. I could hear the pleading in his voice. Just get in the car and we'll go home. My home is here! I screamed so loudly that the windows in the neighboring house opened. Help! I'm being kicked out of my own house! Rhoda came out to the noise. She quickly assessed the situation and came toward us with determination. What's going on here? She asked, standing beside me. Miriam, are you all right? They're kicking me out of the house. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. They say they have some documents, that I'm incapacitated. This is a family matter. Tirza stepped forward, blocking me from Rhoda. Please don't interfere. If Miriam asks for help, I will interfere, Rhoda said firmly. And as far as I know my neighbor, she's perfectly competent. We have a doctor's report and a court order. Tirza showed the papers, but didn't let Rhoda read them. It's all legal. What law is it that says you're throwing her things out on the street? Rhoda pointed to the growing pile of my things on the lawn. It's more like eviction than elder care. We're just packing the essentials, Lloyd interjected. Mom's moving in with us. Against her will? Rhoda raised an eyebrow skeptically. Miriam, do you want to move in with them? No, I shook my head. They want to sell my house to pay off my debts. It's all an act. Tirza's face contorted with anger. We're trying to help. She raised her voice. And she's an ungrateful old woman who thinks of no one but herself. I think the ungrateful people here are different, Rhoda replied calmly. Miriam, you can stay with me until this situation is resolved. She's not going anywhere. Tirza stepped toward Rhoda with a threatening finger. She's coming with us. Only if she wants to. Rhoda took my hand. Come on, Miriam. Let's call a lawyer and get this mess straightened out. I took a step toward Rhoda, but Lloyd blocked my way. Mom, please. His eyes were pleading. Don't make this any harder than it has to be. You made it complicated, Lloyd. I looked at my son, feeling a deep bitterness of betrayal. I never thought you were capable of such a thing. Tirza, maybe, Lloyd began, but his wife interrupted him sharply. No, we will not back down. There's too much at stake. At that moment, another car pulled up. A policeman got out, a young man with a serious face. We got a call about a domestic dispute, he said, looking at us. What's going on here? Tirza immediately rushed to him, showing him her papers. Officer, we're trying to get my mother-in-law, who has been declared incompetent, but the neighbors are preventing us from fulfilling our legal duties as guardians. The policeman took the papers, scrutinizing them carefully. I could see the expression on his face change from wariness to uncertainty. The papers look legitimate, he said at last. But I'm not an expert in such matters. You need to go to court if there's a disagreement about custody. See? Tirza exclaimed triumphantly. We're acting within the law, but throwing things out on the street. The policeman pointed to a pile of my belongings. It's not quite right. And if the old lady doesn't want to go with you... I'm her son and legal guardian, Lloyd intervened, pointing to the papers. I have the right to make decisions about her welfare. The policeman looked uncertain. He clearly didn't want to get involved in a family conflict, especially when dealing with official documents. Ma'am, he turned to me, are you sure you don't want to go with your son? I'm absolutely sure, I replied firmly. I own this house and they're trying to trick me out of it. This is a family matter. The policeman shook his head. I can't interfere with the court's custody decision, but if you feel that your rights have been violated, you should consult a lawyer. With those words, he walked back to his car, leaving us to sort things out on our own. I could see the triumph in Tirza's eyes. She knew the police would not interfere. Pack up, Mom, Lloyd said more confidently. We're leaving. I'm staying here. I crossed my arms across my chest, ready to stand my ground. As you wish, Tirza suddenly agreed, surprising both Lloyd and me. Stay outside. The house is ours now. At that moment, the man changing the locks came up to Tirza. All done, ma'am. The locks are changed. Here are the new keys. Tirza took the bunch and showed it to me. See, Miriam? Now you have no choice. Either you come with us or you stay on the street. I looked at my house, the house that Howard and I had built, where I'd spent most of my life. And in that moment, I remembered something important. Something that only I knew. Rhoda, I turned to my neighbor. Can I stay with you for a while? Of course, darling. Rhoda squeezed my hand tightly. As long as it takes. No. Tirza took a step toward us. She must come with us. She's an adult and has the right to choose where she wants to live, Rhoda replied calmly. If she wants to stay with me, she'll stay with me. I could see Tirza seething with rage, but even she realized that to physically force me to go with them would be to cross a line that could have serious legal consequences. Okay, she finally said. You can stay at your girlfriend's, but the house is ours now, and you're not coming back here. With that, she headed for the front door, opening it defiantly with her new key. Lloyd followed her without looking back. I stood on the lawn among the scattered things, feeling devastated and betrayed. Rhoda put her arm around my shoulders. Come on, dear. We'll sort it all out. She bent down, picking up a broken framed photograph of me and Howard's wedding portrait. We'll get your things together and come to my place. Rhoda and I gathered everything that had been thrown out of the house clothes, books, photo albums, jewelry. I tried not to look at the windows of my house where Lloyd and Tirza were now in charge. As we walked toward Rhoda's house, I was suddenly reminded of something that only I knew. The secret that Howard had entrusted to me so many years ago. A secret entrance to the basement made during the Cold War. Lloyd and Tirza could take my house, but they didn't know all its secrets. Rhoda's house was cozy, but it wasn't mine. Every object, every corner reminded me that I was a guest here, a refugee from my own life. My neighbor did her best to make me comfortable. She cleared out the guest bedroom, made tea with mint and honey, even pulled out her old photo albums, trying to distract me from my heavy thoughts. Don't worry, Miriam, she repeated, stroking my arm. We'll go to court, prove that the documents are forgeries. You need a good lawyer. I nodded in agreement, but my thoughts were far away. I was thinking about Howard, about what he'd do in my place. My husband wasn't impulsive or confrontational, but he was principled and never allowed justice to be compromised. Toward evening, Bert, an old lawyer friend of mine, called. Rhoda had told him what had happened, and he was outraged to the core. This is clearly a fraud, Miriam, he said when I picked up the phone. A judgment in absentia without your participation? The opinion of a doctor who didn't even evaluate your cognitive function? We're appealing this to the higher courts. How long will that take? I asked, knowing that litigation could take months, if not years. Bert was silent, and in his silence I heard an unpleasant truth. It could take a while, he finally admitted. First, we'd have to get an independent medical report proving your competency. Then we'll have to appeal the court's decision. Then there will be a hearing. They'll have sold the house by then. I could feel the desperation building inside me. I could try to get a temporary restraining order against the property until the dispute was resolved, Bert suggested. But I can't guarantee anything. It all depends on the judge. We agreed to meet tomorrow at his office to start the process, but I realized that even the fastest legal route might be too slow. Tirza wasn't the type to wait. She'd probably already contacted realtors and potential buyers. After talking to Bert, I went up to my assigned room, citing fatigue. Rhoda nodded understandingly, offering to call her if I needed anything. When I was alone, I pulled a small notebook out of my bag with a worn leather cover. It was Howard's journal, the one I'd grabbed before Lloyd and Tirza had kicked me out of the house. It wasn't the most personal or emotional document. My husband wasn't prone to pouring his soul out on paper. It was more of a work journal, where he recorded the technical details of various projects. I flipped through the pages in Howard's neat engineering handwriting until I found what I was looking for, the section on our house. Howard had written down everything from the type of cement used to the wiring diagram, but I was particularly interested in the notes on the underground shelter. In 1962nd year, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world was on the brink of nuclear war, Howard participated in a government program to create bomb shelters for civilians. As an engineer with experience in the military industry, he was called upon to design underground structures that could withstand shock waves and radiation. The program was eventually scrapped, but Howard applied what he learned to our own home. He was never an alarmist, but believed in foresight. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, was his credo. So when we built the house in the 60s, he designed and equipped a shelter under the basement. No one but the two of us knew of its existence, not even Lloyd. I found a detailed diagram of the secret entrance in my journal. It wasn't in the house itself, but in a shed that adjoined the back of the building. The barn had been built later than the main house after Lloyd was born, so my son had never shown any interest in it. To him, it was just a utility room where gardening tools and junk were stored. According to the diagram, behind a false panel in the back wall of the shed, there was a small trapdoor leading into a tunnel about 15 meters long. The tunnel ended with a hatch in the floor of the shelter, which was located directly under the basement of the house. There was another way out of the shelter, a disguised hatch in the corner of the basement, hidden under an old carpet and a heavy metal cabinet. Howard regularly checked the condition of the shelter and the tunnel, oiled the hinges of the hatches, and changed the bulbs in the emergency lights. After his death, I continued this tradition, though with less regularity. The last time I went down there about 6 months ago, everything was in working order, though covered with a thin layer of dust. Now this secret passage was my only chance to reclaim the house. I wasn't going to storm in with guns or call the police after today's incident. I realized that the official authorities wouldn't side with me without a long legal fight. I needed a different strategy. I remembered Tirza, cold, calculating, but also nervous and superstitious. Once years ago, when she and Lloyd had just married, we had watched an old horror movie together. Tirza, always demonstrating her rationality and superiority, suddenly flinched at every scary scene. Later, Lloyd told me in confidence that his wife was panic-stricken by the dark and strange noises. As for Lloyd, I knew his weaknesses from childhood. Despite his ostentatious bravado, he had always been impressionable and easily suggestible. As a teenager, after reading books on the paranormal, he'd slept with the lights on for almost a month, convinced there was a ghost hiding in his closet. A plan began to form in my head. I couldn't kick them out physically or legally, at least not right away. But I could use psychology, make their stay in the house so uncomfortable that they would want to leave on their own. I reread Howard's notes on the ventilation and wiring system. The shelter was designed so that the main utilities of the house could be accessed through it. It gave me the ability to manipulate the lighting, heating, and even the acoustics of individual rooms. But I needed help. Going down the tunnel alone at my age was risky. Besides, the plan required extra hands and some technical knowledge. I thought of Rhoda's nephew, Vince. He was an electrician and had recently helped me replace the kitchen wiring. He was a reliable young man, not prone to asking too many questions. Besides, I knew he had some animosity toward Lloyd after my son had refused to pay for his work, citing some perceived shortcomings. It's settled. I'll talk to Rhoda and Vince tomorrow. Tonight, I needed to rest and regain my strength for the hard battle ahead for my house. I woke up this morning with a clear head and a firm resolve. At breakfast, Rhoda noticed the change in my mood. "You look better," she said, pouring me coffee. "Is there a plan?" "Perhaps," I said evasively. "Rhoda, is your nephew Vince still working as an electrician?" "Yes, why?" She raised her eyebrows in surprise. "I need his help. I need your help, too. I told her about the secret entrance and my plan to scare Lloyd and Tirza." Rhoda listened with growing amazement. "A bomb shelter in your house?" She shook her head. Howard had always been eccentric, but this is impressive. "It was the era of nuclear paranoia," I shrugged. "A lot of people were building shelters back then. Howard just did his with engineering meticulousness." "And you want to use it to what exactly?" Rhoda looked worried. "To scare them," I answered bluntly. "Not to harm them, just to make their stay so unpleasant that they'll want to leave." Rhoda thought for a moment, tapping her fingers on the table. "It's risky, Miriam. What if they call the police or the builders to check the house? They just moved in yesterday and they'll start complaining about strange noises and phenomena right away." I smiled. That would only confirm their own paranoia. Besides, no one knows about the tunnel. It's not marked on any of the house plans. Rhoda hesitated a moment longer, but then nodded. "I'll call Vince, but be warned, if it gets dangerous, we stop immediately." By noon, Vince was at our place. He was a tall, sturdy man of about 35, with intelligent eyes and a practical approach to life. He listened carefully to my story, asked a few technical questions about the tunnel and shelter design, and studied the diagrams in Howard's diary. "Interesting engineering work," he said with professional respect. "Your husband knew his business, Mrs. Barlow." "So you're going to help us?" I asked bluntly. "I'd love to," Vince smiled. "I'd never liked Lloyd. And what he did to you? It wasn't right. We began to work out a detailed plan of action. Vince suggested several technical solutions that could enhance the effect of our psychological attack. The ventilation system gives us the ability to create strange sounds in different parts of the house, he explained, pointing to a diagram. And through the electrical panel in the basement, we can control the lights, turn them on and off at will. The main thing is not to overdo it, Rhoda warned. No physical harm, only fright. Absolutely, I agreed. My goal isn't revenge. It's to get my house back. Vince took out a sheet of paper and began to draw up a list of equipment: flashlights, walkie-talkies, tools, a few technical devices whose names didn't tell me anything. I can get it all by tonight, he said when he finished the list. And at night we'll start the operation. Why tonight? Rhoda asked. First of all, there's less chance of being seen, Vince explained. Secondly, people are more susceptible to fear at night, especially if they're awakened by strange noises. We agreed to meet at 10 o'clock at night and reconnoiter to make sure the barn was unlocked and the tunnel was functioning. I spent the rest of the day with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I had doubts about whether I was doing the right thing, whether I was crossing some moral line. On the other, I felt righteous anger. Lloyd and Tirzah had tricked me out of my home, humiliated me, treated me like an unreasonable child. They deserved to experience the fear and insecurity they put me through. Toward evening, Bert called. He had examined the copies of the documents Tirzah had shown the policeman and was outraged. It's clearly a forgery, Miriam, he said. Dr. Webster's report was written retroactively, without any tests. I've already contacted him and he's shocked. His signature has been forged. And the court decision? I asked, feeling hopeful. It's more complicated, Bert admitted. Technically, the procedure had been followed, albeit with irregularities. Your son managed to convince the judge that you couldn't attend the hearing for health reasons, and the decision was made in absentia. We can challenge it, but it'll take time. How long? At least 2 to 3 weeks to prepare the paperwork and schedule the hearing. Maybe a month or more. I thanked Bert for the information and asked him to continue the legal fight. But now I was even more certain that my plan was the only way to get the house back quickly. At 9:30 that evening, Vince picked Rhoda and me up. In the trunk of his car were bags of equipment. We parked on a nearby street and walked, keeping in the shade of the trees. My house was lit up. The lights were on in the living room and kitchen windows. I saw the silhouette of Tirzah walking past the window and felt a stab of pain. This woman was in my house, using my things, sleeping in my bed, all through lies and manipulation. We walked around the back of the house, staying away from the windows. The shed was unlocked. Apparently Lloyd and Tirzah hadn't gotten to it yet. It smelled of sawdust, old wood, and machine oil, familiar odors that reminded me of Howard, who often worked here on his projects. Vince shined a flashlight into the shed, and I pointed to the back wall where a false panel hid behind a tool rack. We need to move it, I whispered. Just be careful not to make any noise. Vince nodded and gestured for Rhoda and me to shine the light, then gently grasped the edge of the shelving unit. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter, he pushed the heavy structure away, careful not to make a creak or a clatter. When the shelving unit was pulled away, we were faced with an ordinary-looking wooden wall. I stepped closer and felt a small indentation in a certain spot. When I pressed it, I heard a soft click and part of the wall moved slightly inward. There it is, I whispered, pointing to the faint line that outlined the secret door. Vince pressed the panel gently and it slid aside, revealing a dark passage. The flashlight's beam revealed the beginning of a narrow tunnel with concrete walls that led underground. Impressive, Vince said quietly. Your husband was a real engineer. I felt a surge of pride in Howard. Even years after his death, his work still commanded the respect of professionals. We need to check on the tunnel, I said. I hadn't been down there in over 6 months. Vince nodded and, turning on a more powerful flashlight, stepped into the passage. Rhoda and I followed him. The tunnel was a little shorter than average human height. Vince had to tilt his head slightly. The walls were dry. The drainage system Howard had installed was still working well. The air was musty, but not stale, thanks to the ventilation ducts. We moved forward slowly, lighting the way with flashlights. After 15 meters, the tunnel ended with a metal hatch in the ceiling. That's the entrance to the shelter, I explained. From there was another hatch that led to the basement of the house. Vince studied the mechanism of the hatch, a simple but secure lock that opened with the turn of a lever. Shouldn't be a problem to open, he said. But let's make sure there's no one in the basement first. He carefully turned the lever and the hatch rose silently. Howard oiled all the hinges regularly, and I continued the tradition. Vince went up to the shelter first, then helped me and Rhoda. The shelter was a small room about 3 by 4 meters, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. There were metal racks of canned food, long out of date, jerry cans of water, a first aid kit, and even a battery-operated radio. In the corner were 2 narrow bunks stacked against the wall. A real Cold War shelter, Rhoda whispered, looking around. Like a museum. Vince, meanwhile, was already examining the second hatch, the one that led to the basement. It's blocked, he said quietly. There's something up there. Something heavy. A metal cabinet, I nodded. Howard had put it there to disguise the hatch, but we weren't going to go out through the basement, were we? Vince nodded and started pulling equipment out of his bags. He explained that through the ventilation ducts we could access the ductwork for the whole house, and through the electrical panel in one of the walls of the shelter, we could access the wiring. First, let's go over the plan of action, Vince said, laying out the house and wiring diagrams on the floor. We need to be coordinated. We leaned over the paperwork, discussing the details of the operation. The plan was simple. Create an atmosphere of anxiety and fear in the house through sounds, temperature fluctuations, and light manipulation. No direct contact with Lloyd and Tirza, no threats or damage, just psychological pressure. They must think the house is protesting their presence, I explained. Tirza is superstitious and Lloyd is impressionable. If they do it right, they'll be ready to flee by morning. And if it doesn't work? Rhoda asked. Then we'll go to plan B, I said. But first, we'll try this one. The plan was ready. Vince plugged the equipment into the electrical panel in the shelter, giving him control of the lights in the house. I pulled from my bag the small box of chemicals I'd brought from Rhoda's house before I left. What are these? Rhoda asked curiously, looking at the vials of colored liquids. My little collection, I smiled. When you retire after 30 years as a chemist, some habits remain. I always kept a basic kit at home for experimentation. Harmless, of course. I showed her a vial of clear liquid. It's peppermint essential oil. It's very concentrated with a pungent odor. We'll spread it around the house through the vents. An unexpected peppermint scent in the middle of the night will make them wary. Then I pointed to a vial of powder. And this is iron sulfide. Combined with acid, it gives off hydrogen sulfide, the smell of rotten eggs. Very unpleasant, though harmless in small doses. We'll use it later, when they're nervous enough. Vince whistled approvingly. Chemical attack, then. Clever. And I'll add sound and light effects. He showed us a small device that looked like a speaker. It's an ultrasonic emitter. The human ear doesn't perceive ultrasound itself, but it creates vibrations that we feel as discomfort, anxiety, worry, a sense of alien presence. Police sometimes use such devices to disperse crowds. Is it safe? Rhoda worried. Absolutely, Vince nodded. In these doses, it just makes you uncomfortable without causing any harm. As soon as we turn it off, the sensation will go away. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 11 o'clock at night. The house was quiet. Apparently, Lloyd and Tirza had already gone to bed. It was the perfect time to start our operation. We'll start small, I said. First, slight temperature fluctuations, then strange odors, then sounds and light manipulations. Gradually build up the tension. Vince nodded and turned on the first device. A small fan pointed into the duct leading into the bedroom. The cold air from the basement was meant to create the sensation of a sudden drop in temperature. We waited, listening for sounds from upstairs. After a while, we heard the bed creak. Someone had turned or sat up. It's working, Vince whispered. They'd noticed the change in temperature. Next, I sprayed a small amount of peppermint essential oil into the air shaft. The odor was strong and distinct, unexpected for a bedroom in the middle of the night. We heard movement upstairs again, more intense now. Someone got out of bed, and footsteps were heard. They're awake, Rhoda whispered. What's next? Now sound, Vince said, and turned on a device that produced a low-frequency hum that sounded like the workings of some mechanism deep underground. The effect was almost instantaneous. We heard a woman's startled cry, Tirzah. "Lloyd, do you hear that?" Her voice was muffled by the ceiling, but her fear was palpable. "What the hell?" It was Lloyd, his voice sounding concerned, but not as panicked as his wife's. Vince amplified the sound slightly, adding occasional clicks and crackles to the monotonous hum. At the same time, he began to manipulate the lights in the second-floor hallway flickering at irregular intervals. "God, what's wrong with this house?" Tirzah exclaimed. "The lights are going crazy." "It must be a wiring problem," Lloyd tried to rationalize, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "I'll check the panel." We heard footsteps on the stairs. Lloyd was coming down to the first floor. It was exactly what we'd been waiting for. "It's time to move on to the next phase," I said, pulling out a vial of iron sulfide. "When he reaches the kitchen, I'll run this reaction into the vent next to the electrical panel." We listened to Lloyd's footsteps, tracking his movements through the house. He passed through the living room, then opened the door to the hallway leading to the kitchen, where the main electrical panel was located. At that moment, I mixed iron sulfide with citric acid and a drop of water in a small cup, and then brought the cup to the vent. The reaction started instantly. A pungent odor of hydrogen sulfide wafted up the air duct. The effect exceeded all expectations. "My God, what a stench!" Lloyd shouted. We heard him panic as he backed away from the panel, knocking something to the floor. At the same time, Vince began to manipulate the lights throughout the house. The lights in the kitchen, the living room, the hallways began to turn on and off randomly, creating a chaotic flickering effect. "Lloyd, what's going on?" came a frightened cry from upstairs from Tirzah. "I don't know." I could hear the fear in my son's voice now. "It's like the whole house has gone crazy." At that moment, Vince turned on the ultrasonic emitter, aimed precisely at the area between the kitchen and the living room where Lloyd was now. Although the sound itself was inaudible, it created a sense of unease and discomfort. "What's that?" We heard Lloyd walking in circles, as if trying to locate the source of his anxiety. "Is someone here?" "Now for the final touch," I whispered, and pulled out the last component of my chemical arsenal, a small vial of phosphorescent compound that glows in the dark. I poured it into the hole in the vent that Vince had made in advance, so that the liquid would run down the wall in the living room, creating glowing streams. Through the hidden camera that Vince had installed in one of the ventilation grates, we watched Lloyd's reaction. He was standing in the living room looking around when glowing lines began to appear on the wall behind him, forming irregular streaks. Lloyd turned around and, seeing the strange glow, literally jumped with horror. "Tirzah!" he shouted. "Come down quickly! We have to get out of here!" "What? Why?" Her voice shook with fear. "Just come down, now!" We heard hurried footsteps on the stairs. Tirzah was coming downstairs. When she entered the living room, Vince had created a chaos of light. All the lights flickered at a high frequency, creating a strobe effect. In that flickering light, the phosphorescent smudges on the wall seemed alive, moving. Tirzah screamed, shrilly, on one note. A true scream of terror. "What is this? What is that?" She pointed at the wall where the glowing lines now resembled some strange symbols. "I don't know, but we have to go." Lloyd grabbed her arm. "Now!" "But all of our stuff." "To hell with our stuff, don't you get it? There's something wrong with this house." We watched as they scurried around the living room, trying to gather the essentials: purses, phones, car keys. Tirzah was still struggling, not wanting to leave her stuff behind, but Lloyd was adamant. At this point, I decided to add the final touch. I had one more vial, with a flammable but fast-burning compound. I dribbled a drop onto the hot plate of the electric heater Vince had set up in the living room vent. The effect was instantaneous. A bright light, like a small ball of fire, flashed for a moment in the vent and then went out, leaving only a slight smoke and the smell of ozone. Tirzah screamed again, and Lloyd literally dragged her toward the exit. "This is home!" he shouted. "The house doesn't want us here!" "What house? Are you out of your mind?" Tirzah resisted, but fear had already completely taken over her. "Remember how Mom said that Dad put a part of his soul into this house? That he would never leave it? What if..." Lloyd looked back at the glowing smudges on the wall. What if he was still here? That thought seemed to finally break Tirza's resistance. She no longer objected as Lloyd pulled her toward the exit. All right, let's get out of here. She was practically sobbing. We heard the front door slam, then the sound of a car engine starting. A minute later, the car drove away, taking Lloyd and Tirza away from the house that had scared them so badly. It worked, Rhoda exhaled, unable to believe her eyes. They have really escaped. They'll be back in the morning, Vince warned. When the fear recedes, they'll try to rationalize what happened. They'll think it was a wiring problem or a gas leak. They won't, I said firmly. At least Tirza wouldn't want to go back, and Lloyd would never go against her wishes. How can you be so sure? Rhoda asked. I know my son, and his wife too. I started to gather my chemical vials. Tirza is too rational to believe in ghosts, but also too superstitious to take any chances. She'll find some logical explanation that will allow her to save face. But she'll never cross the threshold of this house again. We decided to stay in the shelter until morning in case Lloyd and Tirza came back. Vince had installed security cameras at the front door and in the living room so that we could monitor the situation. The night passed without anyone returning to the house. In the morning, around 7 o'clock, we climbed out of the shelter through the basement hatch, making sure the house was empty. The living room was a mess, an overturned lamp, scattered things, signs of hasty flight. There were still glowing smudges on the wall, though their brightness had diminished in the daylight. Vince quickly unplugged and reassembled all the equipment he'd installed: ultrasonic emitter, heaters, homemade lighting devices. Leave no trace, he said as he packed the equipment into his bag. If they call in the experts to check the house, they shouldn't find anything unusual. In the meantime, I went through the rooms, looking around my house after being away for 24 hours. Lloyd and Tirza had made some changes. The kitchen had new appliances, and in the bedroom they'd replaced my curtains with their own. On the table in the living room, I noticed an open folder of paperwork. They'd obviously already started preparing the house for sale. I picked up the documents and flipped through them. There were property appraisal forms, preliminary contracts with a real estate agent, even drafts of the listing. They were really going to sell my house, and as soon as possible. Here, I showed Rhoda and Vince one of the documents. A real estate contract signed by Lloyd as my legal representative. They were planning to put the house on the market next week. You should keep these papers, Rhoda said. Your lawyer might need them as proof of their intentions. I nodded and put the papers in my bag. Then I went into the bedroom and opened the closet. Most of my clothes were still there, though Tirza had thrown some of them away and replaced them with her own. They were in such a hurry to take over my house that they didn't even bother to get rid of my stuff, I grinned bitterly. Vince checked the new locks on the doors. Good locks, quality locks, he admitted. But you can open any lock if you know how. He took some tools out of his bag and set to work. 10 minutes later, the lock gave way, and Vince lifted the new keys in triumph. Voila, we now had access to all the entrances. I nodded gratefully and took the keys. My house was under my control again. All I had to do was wait for Lloyd and Tirza to return, if of course they dared to come back. It didn't take long. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, a familiar silver sedan pulled into the driveway. Rhoda, Vince, and I quickly went down to the basement, leaving the front door ajar. I wanted Lloyd and Tirza to see that the house was open to them. Through the security cameras, we saw them drive up to the house and stop, hesitant to get out of the car. Tirza was arguing something fervently, waving her arms. Lloyd looked exhausted. They must have had a sleepless night. Finally, Lloyd got out of the car and walked slowly toward the house. He noticed the door ajar and stopped, clearly alarmed. Then pulled out his cell phone and appeared to call the police. We heard him report a possible break-in. The police will be here in 10 minutes, Vince said, listening to the conversation. We need to act fast. I nodded and went upstairs. It was time to face my son. Lloyd was still standing at the front door, hesitant to enter the house when I appeared in the doorway. When he saw me, he recoiled as if he'd seen a ghost. Mom? What are you doing here? I live here, Lloyd, I said calmly. This is my house, remember? He looked back at the car where Tirza was sitting, but she didn't move, Just grip the steering wheel tighter. But how did you get in? We changed the locks. I have my own methods. I smiled. This house holds many secrets that only I know. Lloyd's face turned pale. He clearly remembered the events of last night. What happened here last night? He asked, lowering his voice. Those sounds, the lights, the smells. Was it you, Father? Your father? I pretended not to understand. What are you talking about, Lloyd? Don't pretend! His voice was a mixture of fear and anger. Something strange is going on in this house. Something supernatural. The only supernatural phenomenon I'm witnessing is my own son kicking me out of my house using forged documents. I replied coldly. Now that's really out of the ordinary, Lloyd stammered, not knowing what to say. At that moment, Tirzah finally got out of the car. She kept her distance as if she were afraid to approach the house. We have to leave, Lloyd, she said, looking not at me but somewhere over my head. I'm not staying in this house for a minute. But all our things. To hell with our things, she exclaimed, repeating his words from yesterday. We'll buy new ones. We'll just get out of here. Her eyes were full of fear, not of me, but of the house, which she thought was inhabited by something inexplicable and hostile. Listen to your wife, Lloyd, I said. Go away. This house will never be yours. Lloyd hesitated, looking at me and at Tirzah. I could see greed and fear struggling in him, the desire to get the money from the sale of the house and the horror of the night before. Your father always said that a house is more than just walls, I continued. It is a living organism that remembers everyone who has lived in it and knows who lives in it. And it chooses its own masters. It was pure improvisation. Howard had never said anything like that, but the effect exceeded all expectations. Lloyd turned even paler. Let's leave, he said decisively and turned to Tirzah. You're right, to hell with this house. Just then, a police car pulled up. The same young officer who had come to the domestic dispute call yesterday got out. We have a report of a possible break-in, he said as he approached us. It's okay, officer, Lloyd replied hastily. It's my mother. She has every right to be here. The policeman shifted his gaze to me, recognizing me. So you've decided to go back to your son after all, ma'am? No, officer, I answered firmly. My son and his wife have decided to give me my house back and leave. Isn't that right, Lloyd? Lloyd swallowed, clearly not expecting this turn, but then nodded. Yes, we thought it would be better for Mom to stay in her house. He glanced at Tirzah, who now looked as if she were ready to tear him apart, but kept silent for fear of the policeman. Well, it looks like things are settling down peacefully. The policeman looked satisfied with the outcome. I'm glad you were able to settle your differences without resorting to legal measures. I nodded gratefully as Lloyd and Tirzah hurriedly got into the car. A minute later, they drove away without even saying goodbye. The policeman talked to me for a while longer, made sure I was all right, and left too. Just then, Rhoda and Vince came out of the house. I can't believe it, Rhoda said, looking at the police car as it drove away. They just gave up the house. Fear is a powerful weapon, said Vince, especially fear of the unknown. I stared at my house in silence, the house that was mine again. The porch where Howard and I had so often sat on warm summer evenings. The apple tree in the orchard that had been planted the year Lloyd was born. My son who betrayed me for money. The pain of his betrayal hasn't gone away and probably never will completely. But now I felt relief and a strange satisfaction. I had protected my home, my dignity, my independence. What now? Rhoda asked, putting her hand on my shoulder. They may come back with the lawyers, with the police. They won't, I said confidently. Tirzah's too scared to cross the threshold of this house again. And Lloyd, he's always been a weakling. He'll follow her, as he always has. But legally, they can still have a claim on the house, Vince reminded me. Those deeds. Bert will take care of the deeds, I smiled. In the meantime, we had work to do to clean up our night's activities and get the house back to normal. The three of us went into the house, and I closed the door behind us this time with the firm intention of closing it. Determined never to let anyone kick me out of my own home again. The house belonged to me again. After Lloyd and Tirzah left, Rhoda, Vince, and I carefully cleaned up all traces of our night's activities. We removed the phosphorescent residue from the walls, unplugged the makeshift devices from the ventilation shafts, and put back the furniture that Tirzah had moved during her brief visit. "We need to call a locksmith to officially change the locks back," Vince said, examining the front door. "I can pick the lock, but for full legal protection, it's better to do it by the book." I nodded in agreement. We really needed to seal my victory not only factually, but legally as well. While Vince called a locksmith he knew, I walked around the house, assessing the damage done in the short time Lloyd and Tirzah had been there. There were new appliances in the kitchen, an expensive coffee machine, a blender, an electric kettle. In the living room, they'd moved the couch and removed my old family photos, replacing them with faceless, modern posters. In the bedroom, they'd changed the bedding and curtains. All my personal belongings were piled carelessly in one of the guest rooms. Obviously, they planned to throw them away later. There I found photo albums, Howard's letters, his awards and diplomas, all the things that made up our family's history. A history that Lloyd and Tirzah were going to erase to write their own, but only on the papers for the sale of the house. On the desk in Howard's study, which I'd turned into my library, was a stack of papers. I looked through them and found what I expected to find: the paperwork to prepare the house for sale, the preliminary arrangements with the real estate agent, the appraisal of the property's value. But among these documents, I found something more interesting: bank statements and notices of overdue payments. I scrutinized them. It turned out that Lloyd and Tirzah's financial situation was even worse than I'd realized. They hadn't just taken out a business loan that had gone bad. They had racked up multiple consumer loans, living beyond their means, buying expensive furniture, appliances, clothes, and traveling to exotic countries. When their business project failed, they already had such a debt load that even the sale of their apartment would not cover all the debts. That's why they planned to take over my house. With the rising real estate prices in our neighborhood, it was worth much more than they needed to pay off their debts. They probably planned to spend the remainder on a new venture, or just to maintain their profligate lifestyle. I was struck not only by their financial frivolity, but also by the cold calculation with which they planned to use me. In one of Tirzah's handwritten documents, I found calculations: the value of the house, minus the debts, minus the maintenance of an elderly relative, i.e., me, equaled net profit. My life, my independence, my feelings, everything was translated into numbers, into the expense column. I set the paperwork aside, feeling a mixture of bitterness and anger. Never before had I felt so alienated from my own son. Lloyd had always been a difficult child, dreamy, uncoordinated, easily influenced, but I'd never thought him capable of such betrayal. Vince returned, interrupting my unhappy musings. "The locksmith will be here in an hour," he said. "I'd also called the police station," explained the situation. "They'll send the same officer who's already familiar with the case to officially record your return to the house." "Thank you, Vince." I smiled gratefully. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." "Oh, come on," he waved the embarrassment away. "Anyone would have done the same thing. No one deserves to be kicked out of their own home." Rhoda was in the kitchen at the time, making a late breakfast or an early lunch, I wasn't sure. Through the open door came the appetizing smells of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee. "I called Bert," she said as I entered the kitchen. "He'll be here this afternoon. Said he'd already prepared the paperwork to contest the guardianship." "Good," I nodded. We had to move fast before Lloyd and Tirzah came up with a new plan. We ate in relative silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. After such a busy night and morning, I could feel my eyelids growing heavy and my hands trembling slightly from exertion. Exactly an hour later, as promised, the locksmith arrived, an elderly man with a gray mustache and kind eyes. He quickly inspected the locks, shook his head when he saw how they had been replaced, and got to work. "Unprofessional," he mumbled as he removed the new lock. "They were in a hurry." "I'm putting you a good lock, a reliable one. No one will break in without your knowledge." I thanked him and asked him to make a few extra keys for Rhoda and Vince, just in case. While the locksmith was working, a policeman arrived, the same young officer I was beginning to recognize. "Mr. Kravitz," he introduced himself at last. "James Kravitz. I've come to document your return to the house, Mrs. Barlow." He listened carefully to my account of what happened, examined the forged documents that Lloyd and Tirza had used, and drew up an official report. This gives you legal protection in case your son and his wife try to evict you again, Officer Kravitz explained. But I would still recommend going to court to have the custody order overturned altogether. My lawyer is already working on that, I nodded. He'll be here today. Great, Officer Kravitz closed his notebook. If there are any more problems, call me directly. He left me his card and left. The locksmith had finished the job by then too and handed me a set of new keys. Here. Now no one will enter without your permission, he assured me. The locks are strong, reliable. I paid him, and he left too. Rhoda, Vince, and I were alone in the house that had become my fortress again. I think we can rest now, I said, sinking into my favorite chair in the living room. It had been the busiest 24 hours of my life. Rhoda nodded, settling back on the couch. Vince decided to check again to see if there were any traces of our night's operation, so he went to inspect the ventilation shafts and the basement. Bert arrived around 3 in the afternoon, energetic despite his age, and carrying a leather briefcase full of papers. He was outraged by what had happened and determined to get justice. I've already filed a petition to overturn the custody order, he said, setting the papers on the table. We have Dr. Webster's statement that his signature was forged. We've got witness statements that prove you're completely lucid. Plus now we have a police report on the illegal eviction. How fast is this going to work? I asked, looking through the paperwork. I think we'll get a temporary suspension of the custody order within a week, Bert answered. A full reversal could take a month or two depending on the court's workload. What if Lloyd and Tirza try to do something in the meantime? It's unlikely. Bert shook his head. Given that they've already left the house and recognized your right to live here in the presence of a police officer, it would be hard for them to make any new claims. Besides, he pointed to the documents I'd found. These papers clearly show their true motives. If it goes to court, they'll look very bad. I nodded, feeling relieved. The legal machine had been set in motion, and now my home would be protected not only by new locks, but also by the force of the law. There's something else I wanted to talk to you about. Bert pulled another document out of his briefcase. Your will. Given what's happened, you might want to make some changes. I took the paper and looked it over. Indeed, according to the will that had been in effect when Howard was alive, all of our property, including the house, was to go to Lloyd when I died. Yes, I definitely want to make the changes, I said firmly. Bert and I had worked out a new version of the will. Now most of my estate was to go to charity, to a domestic violence fund, and an elderly housing program. I left a small amount to Rhoda for her kindness and help, and nothing to Lloyd and Tirza. Are you sure? Bert asked when we were finished. He is your son, after all. I'm sure. I didn't hesitate. I didn't. Anyone who can throw his own mother out on the street for money doesn't deserve an inheritance. Blood relation is not family. Family is caring, respect, love. I didn't get any of that from Lloyd. Bert nodded understandingly and finalized the document. I signed the new will with the feeling that I was closing an important chapter of my life. After Bert left, Rhoda and I sat on the veranda, watching the sun go down. Vince had left. He had work scheduled for tonight, but he promised to stop by tomorrow to make sure I was okay. Are you okay? Rhoda asked, handing me a cup of tea. Tired, I admitted honestly, physically and emotionally. But at the same time, I feel strangely relieved, like I'd shed a heavy weight I didn't even realize I was carrying. A load of false expectations, Rhoda nodded. We often expect our children to conform to our ideas of family, of duty, of love. And when they don't, we agonize, looking for the reason in ourselves, trying to make things right. Sometimes you just have to let go. I thought about what she said. Really, how many years had I tried to fix things with Lloyd? How many times had I looked for excuses for his coldness, his infrequent visits, his obvious discomfort in my presence? I always thought there was some of it my fault. Maybe I was too strict, or maybe I wasn't attentive enough. Maybe I should have been more supportive of him in his conflicts with his father. But now, after what had happened, I finally accepted a simple truth. Lloyd had made his choice. He chose money over family, comfort over debt, Tirza over his mother, and it was his choice, his decision, his responsibility. You're right, I said to Rhoda. Sometimes you just have to let go, even if it's your only son. She squeezed my hand silently, and we continued to watch the sunset. The golden rays of the setting sun colored my garden, my apple tree, my house, all the things I had preserved, fought for, and won. The next few weeks passed in the hassle of getting my life back to normal. I put all my belongings back in place, cleaned up the traces of Lloyd and Tirza's stay, made the house my own again. Bert gave me regular updates on the progress of the custody case. As he had predicted, the court quickly suspended the previous judgment and then reversed it completely, recognizing that it had been obtained by fraud. Lloyd and Tirza made no attempt to contact me or somehow challenge my right to the house. According to Bert, they sold their apartment and moved to another city, apparently fleeing creditors and the memories of the house that had so frightened them. I didn't feel joy at the news, but I didn't feel grief either. Rather, it was a quiet acceptance of reality. Lloyd was out of my life and likely forever. I lost my son, but I kept myself, my independence, my home. Rhoda became a frequent visitor to my home, and sometimes I would drop in on her. We discovered that we had a lot in common: a love of gardening, classic literature, old movies. Vince dropped in regularly too, fixing things that needed manly hands, giving advice on security updates, just chatting over a cup of tea. One day, sitting in my library going through Howard's old books, I found a notebook I'd never seen before. In it were his thoughts about family, about home, about the future. One entry in particular touched me. Home is not stone and wood. A home is the people who fill it with warmth and meaning. I am not building these walls for myself, but for Miriam, for Lloyd, for all those who will come after us. May they find the same happiness here that I found. I closed the book, tears welling up in my eyes. Howard was right. Home is about people. But sometimes those people aren't the people we expect. My family now consisted of Rhoda, Vince, Bert, the people who had come to my rescue when blood relatives betrayed me. And it was a real family. Not bound by blood, but bound by something stronger: respect, caring, a genuine desire to do good for each other. I put aside my notebook and went to the window. Behind it was my orchard, my apple tree, my life. A life that I had defended and that I could now control as I saw fit. There was so much to do: planting new flowers in the garden, updating the kitchen, maybe even taking that trip Howard and I had always dreamed of but never realized. And most importantly, to give this house a new meaning, a new family, a new life. A life without Lloyd and Tirza, without fear or betrayal, without looking back. A life in which I myself determine who my family is, who is worthy of my love and my inheritance.